David McLaughlin joins us now. He was Brian Mulroney's chief of staff for a period of time in the 1990s. David, I'm sorry for your loss on a day like this. Thank you so much for joining us. What are your thoughts on the passing of the former Prime Minister?
Well, thinking about my time with him, obviously, and the things that we did together and the amazing opportunity he gave me as a young political staffer to be part of his office and to help him in a modest way on the things that he was trying to do for the country. He appointed me as chief of staff, and the point I was the youngest chief of staff ever at the time. It was for a brief period, but it was momentous for me. And that, as I say, that Brian Mulroney gave many chances to young Conservatives at the time to participate. And so I'm obviously thinking about that. But most of all, I'm thinking about what he meant for the country. I mean, this was a prime minister, David, who strove for big things. I mean, he wanted big things for the country. He was not a small thinker by any means. Sure, he was politically, political tactician and all that. And there's lots of controversies and lots of things that he was, he and his government had to deal with. But ultimately, big things. And I think that'll be his legacy. Free trade, the climate change and the environment. He went to the Rio Earth Summit and led the charge that helped bring the United States into the biodiversity agreement at the time, that helped create the foundation for the what has now become the Conference of the Parties, COP, and climate change action around the world, so desperately needed. And he was a big voice on the international scene. And so, one of the things I got to do with him was I did all the foreign travel with him as the sort of the senior staffer. And it was amazing that, to get that opportunity. I met prime ministers and presidents, Nelson Mandela, that we're in the Kremlin, with an event for Boris Yeltsin, and beautiful frescoes and a lovely building. And, we're in the Kremlin and we're in the receiving line. I go, I have to shake his hand on the way by, and he leans over and says in that, inevitable, that baritone of Brian Mulroney, "You've come a long way from New Brunswick, haven't you, David?" Right? So, this was like, it was in many ways a joy to be with him, but always conscious of here was a prime minister who was really trying to do big things. Some things didn't work out, the Constitution, but I was proud. I'm even more proud now when I think about proud to have had the chance and proud of what he tried to do.
Well, to be fair, he'd come a long way from Central Nova, that by-election he won in Nova Scotia to get into the House of Commons.
Absolutely. He knew of what he spoke, for sure.
So David, you said he gave a lot of opportunities to young staffers, and you were a young chief of staff when he tapped you for that job. How did you first come to know Brian Mulroney? How did you first meet him? What can you tell us about that?
Through the 1983 leadership process, and that was before there was any kind of social media or something. Fax. I'm not even certain fax machines were invented then, to be honest. But so he reached out by phone. I remember I was a delegate out of New Brunswick, and I was also head of the PC Youth, which meant I controlled, if you will, a number of delegates. So I had some, I had some get, as they say in the business. So he reached out literally 5 times to convince me to join his team. And I ended up spending an hour and a half with him in a camper van, of all things, an RV, driving from St. John to Fredericton for an event. And by the time, met him in St. John, by the time we stopped and parked in Fredericton, I had signed up. So that commitment of time and focus, like, he made you feel like the most important person in the room. He got that. And so we joined, and I helped him in whatever I could, and won the leadership. And then eventually I moved to Ottawa and helped out in government. And the rest is, at least for me anyways, is history. Maybe not for him, but it was for me.
Well, but I mean, all these years later, you remember how many times he reached out to you. You remember that conversation. You remember how he convinced you and connected with you. And this is a common theme, David, in all of the conversations, is that deep personal connection. And you were there as chief of staff, sort of in some of the darker times for the government, and this is something that served him very well, his ability to reach out to people and connect with people. What did you see when you were in the office, his ability to just keep everyone together?
He worked at it, to be honest, David. Like, he worked the phones like crazy, because that was, the vehicle, that was the device. And I would get home and literally around 9 o'clock every night, the phone would ring. And the Prime Minister's office saying, "Mr. McLaughlin, yes, Prime Minister's office here. The Prime Minister would like to speak with you." "Yeah, sure." Anytime. Took the call, and it would be, "So what's going on?" And it was just like an opening thing. And he would listen. didn't always like engage in terms of like, oh, well, what do you mean by that and all this. He wanted to get information. And I'm sure after he finished with me, he went on to the next person he wanted to, like, he worked assiduously to know what was going on, to understand and connect that up. And in the process, he always asked, how are you? How's the family? These kinds of things. And so in that very dark period, to say, politically for government, when you're very unpopular, unpopular government now, times, these things happen. The caucus was extraordinarily supportive of Brian Mulroney as prime minister. And the reason being is that they saw that good side of him, that personal side of him. And he would reach out, call people, how's the family? What's going on? If there was a death in the family or sickness, and that he put stuff aside to speak with them as a human being, as a person. And so, there was no trained SEALs caucus members just for votes. It was very much a family thing. And for political staff, it was the same. I was on a trip with him in London. I had a very bad cough and hacking away and that. And I had to go brief him on something in his suite in the room. And so he and Mrs. Mulroney, Mila, were there, both in their house coats. And I was coughing, and she said, "Stop it, come into the bathroom." And she fed me Buckley's cough syrup, which really is as bad as it sounds.
It tastes awful, but it works.
Oh,
yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
It worked, right? And so, that was the kind of thing. And, you will do this. And she said, like, Brian, stop it. Like, stop talking to David. David needs to take some cough syrup. So, well, fine. And we always loved traveling with Mrs. Mulroney because, of course, it softened him a little bit. He made him a little easier to deal with. He was a little less intense. I mean, all of those things were very, very memorable moments on that. But he was always on. He carried the country proudly. He tried, they talked about the media and others, made fun of and challenged him on, like, he was always the way he dressed and everything. He was always too elegant or something, or too well made up. And he thought very strongly, I'm representing Canada and I have to look my best. I need to do this. And that conveyed down. The rest of us in the office were very proud about that, as I'm sure other staff are with other prime ministers. It's a unique piece of it. But at the end of the day, it was really about what he did for the country. And we felt if we were helping in that way, on big issues, what a chance to deal with big issues. So I worked on NAFTA, I worked on free trade, I worked on the Constitution, budgets and throne speeches, and we had a chance. He gave us a chance to do that. It was a hell of a ride, David. It was just a hell of a ride.
It was a hell of a ride. David McLaughlin, thanks so much for taking our call, and please accept our condolences on the loss of your friend and mentor, Brian Mulroney. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to get reaction now from Peter MacKay, former federal progressive conservative leader, former federal conservative cabinet minister. And Peter MacKay, I'm looking at the history of people who have held the riding of Central Nova in the House of Commons. You're there, your dad is there, and sandwiched in between two stints by your father is Brian Mulroney in Central Nova. What are your thoughts on a day like this?
Well, I think, as so many people have put it, Mr. Mulroney invested in people. It was his humanity. He lived and breathed politics, as others have alluded to, including John Manley. But he really invested in people and knew that was the very essence of politics. And sure, he has deep roots, connections to Nova Scotia, here in Central Nova and Pictou County, but also in Antigonish, where he spent some of his formative years at St. Francis Xavier University. He never forgot that. The Brian Mulroney Institute is a living legacy that he leaves, and he really, began arguably much of his political ascendancy here in Nova Scotia. I was speaking with my father tonight, and he was reflective, of course, and very pensive, but he was talking about what an influence John Diefenbaker had been on Brian Mulroney, and that Brian had told him one time of getting a phone call at his dorm in Antigonish from then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. And so his legacy, his connectivity to so many different parts of the country, parts of the world, really is quite astounding. Even for a Prime Minister of Canada, he leaves a massive, massive mark and influence and legacy behind.
In 1983, your father gave up his seat so Brian Mulroney can run in Central Nova to get into the House of Commons to begin his path to becoming the Prime Minister. What do you remember about that point in time? I think you would have been like a teenager right around then, right? Well, what do you remember about your father stepping down for Brian Mulroney in Central Nova?
David, I remember that by-election well in 1983. It was really the first kind of brush with politics that I'd had, although of course, vicariously through my dad, been around politics for longer, but that was a big deal. And that by-election, I remember well. I was 17 years old. I just got my driver's license shortly before that, and I was Mila's driver. And I would often take her to the events after my father and Mr. Mulroney had left to go and to be there early. And I would take Mrs. Mulroney and Bonnie Brownlee to some of these events. And I one time told Ben about this and said, Ben, I would always somehow, wherever we were going, drive by the high school with the windows down in this big black car that they were using for the campaign. And I told them I was the original Canadian Idol. And it was a very exciting time, to say the least, for many people, including our family. When Mr. Mulroney came here, he stayed at Pictou Lodge. Mm-hmm. I got to know his kids at that time at a very early age, and so our families were close, remain close, and it's a very poignant time, to say the least, to be saying goodbye. But my goodness, again, I come back to the incredible policy and leadership and demonstrative love and patriotism that Mr. Mulroney had as a Canadian, and really that impact was felt and reverberated around the world when he was Prime Minister.
Just as a final point, Peter MacKay, we've been asking people about their thoughts on the legacy Brian Mulroney left behind. They touch on free trade, they touch on apartheid, they touch on his work on acid rain and climate. How do you assess it, and from a political perspective and from a personal perspective?
Well, David, it's hard to encapsulate in a few words, but he certainly, all of those policy implementations that were not easy, that were bold, that were forward-looking, that, as he would say himself, were not made for tomorrow's headlines, but for the good of the country in decades. And he also, I think, was able to shape many things, apartheid quite particularly, in ending the apartheid regime in South Africa, because of his reputation and his persuasiveness, speaking to people like Margaret Thatcher and telling her she'd be on the wrong side of history, and Ronald Reagan the same, and bringing the President of the United States, first George Bush Sr., to the free trade agreement, acid rain, water, all of those things that he cared about in the environment. So many different aspects to this man and his leadership, but really it was his personality and his care that he wore on his sleeve for people, for his country, and first and foremost for his family. But he would very spontaneously call people, as previous speakers have said, if they had suffered a loss or if they were celebrating the birth of a child. And that has certainly been true throughout my life. And that's very much the part that people will miss, because he was so incredible at being present in their lives. I spoke to him Tuesday, and I must say it was a very foreboding call, and so I'll miss him. I miss him deeply tonight.
I understand if you can't tell us anything about that call, but is there anything you can share about that? And I understand it may have been very intimate and personal, and it's okay if you can't.
Well, David, I'll put it this way. I said some things to him that I wanted to say, and I felt that I should say, given sort of what I felt he was going through, and I'm so grateful for that call.
All right. Well, Peter MacKay, we're grateful for you taking our call and coming on today. We're very sorry for your loss. That's Peter MacKay, former federal Conservative leader and former federal cabinet minister. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.